In the name of God, the gracious and merciful, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you. It's wonderful to be speaking on this topic today, and it's a great honour and a great privilege to be speaking with you here. So for my presentation, what I'm looking to cover and talk about is the arguments of free speech and whether the film The Innocence of Muslims would be covered by free speech. Because this is an issue which many people would have talked about, and it's an issue which has been in the media. And I want to look at this from two angles. I want to look at it from human rights law, to ask whether it would be included as free speech within human rights law, but then also to consider whether it would be permissible under Islamic concepts of freedom of speech, under the Islamic Sharia. So to look at both of these issues, and really to give you an introduction, I can tell you my conclusions anyway. I consider that, and this is based upon the guidance of the Quran and the Sunnah, which is the practice of the Holy Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, is that it's very much the same principles are applied under both freedom of speech and the Quran. In terms of human rights law and Islam, both equally protecting freedom of speech, which surprisingly also includes freedom of speech which is offensive. So Islam and human rights law permits offensive speech, legally permits it in terms of prohibitions by human beings. But human rights law and Islam both place limits upon freedom of speech, and they are the same limits, which I'll cover shortly, but essentially defamation that's prohibited under both Islam and under human rights law. Issues of privacy, breaching somebody's privacy is prohibited under both Islam and human rights law. And also, most importantly, hate speech, speech which looks to incite hatred as a result of extremism and intolerance, is prohibited under both Islam and human rights law. So if you want to look at this issue of freedom of speech, there's three main types which we're going to look at: freedom of speech, offensive speech, and hate speech. And we'll look at where does this film fall within those categories to work out how we should regulate it. Let me start with some references from the Holy Quran, which can act as guiding principles for this lecture and also for the response of Muslims. But with it being a universal book, or at least that's the claim of Islam, that it's a universal religion, then perhaps it can offer universal solutions as well. So the first reference which I'd like to give is from Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second chapter of the Holy Quran, from verse 257. And it says as follows: "There should be no compulsion in religion. Surely right has become distinct from wrong." So that's the first, which in effect clearly establishes freedom of speech and freedom of conscience within Islam. Then the second reference I'd like to give is from chapter 41, verse 34 to 36. It reads as follows: "In the name of God, the gracious, the merciful, the good deed and the evil deed are not alike. Repel the evil deed with one which is better. Then lo, he between whom and you there was enmity will become as though he was a bosom friend." So the reason I mention this second principle is because this regulates how we respond to offensive speech and offensive actions. So whereas the first covers the film, freedom of speech, the second covers the response, which we've seen around the world by Muslims, or people that profess to be Muslim, they say the kalima. It's been very much questionable, and it's something which you can assess in light of this particular Quranic reference, whether we feel that violent protests, fires, killing of ambassadors, and destruction of embassies, whether that falls within that Quranic verse. So as we go through, we'll consider these things. Let me start with free speech. So free speech, it's the rights to give out and to receive. So you've got the right to impart, what they call impart, which is I can say and do what I like, pretty much. I can say what I like and do what I like. I've also got the right to receive information and ideas, and I can receive and take in these ideas, and whichever ideas I want, I can seek and I can receive them. So let me give some examples. I am free to say that the Earth orbits the Sun, or I can say that the Sun orbits the Earth. So this was something Galileo wasn't able to say, but this is something which I can say. I'm free to say that global warming is taking place, or to argue that it isn't. Even if that has huge consequences for the universe, well, for the environment of this Earth, I'm still allowed to say it, and I can argue about it. I'm free to call for an independent Scotland, or to call for a United Kingdom. Some people may think that it's the worst possible thing for it to have a United Kingdom, and they may vehemently believe that it's sapping the strength of Scotland, but it's my right to give out this expression. So this is all within the scope of freedom of speech. And we'd all be quite happy with that, I think. I think everybody here would say, great, freedom of speech, that sounds good, we should all have that, and I'm very glad we have that, Islamically and in terms of secular regulation of states. But would we also be happy with the concept of offensive speech, speech which is shocking and offensive and disturbing? And are we ready to protect that? So this is a question which we should put to each other, and we should consider it seriously for a second, because many people will say that, oh, that's offensive, so we shouldn't accept it. But, and I'll put this out there, and I'll love to prove it to you, that Islam and human rights both protect and secure offensive speech. Legally, in terms of human regulations of each other, we can offend each other, we can shock each other, we can disturb each other. I'll come in a moment to say whether we should morally do that, whether it's moral and whether it's good moral practice to be offensive and shocking and disturbing. But legally, human rights and Islam, I would suggest, both permit this type of speech. So I'm building this up really to make it controversial, because I think it's important that we recognise just how far Islam is ready to go in order to protect freedom of speech. Let me give you some examples from the Quran. So chapter 25, verse 64 says as follows: in the name of God, the gracious, the merciful. And the servants of the gracious God are those who walk on the earth in a dignified manner, and when the ignorant address them, they say peace. They say peace or salam. So this is a clear example of, I am here and I am minding my own business. Somebody walks past me, they say something to me which I consider to be ignorant and offensive to me. How am I to respond to it? The commandment given by the Quran is to respond with peace. Not to legally prohibit it, but to morally rise above it. And in fact, I think the clearest example of permission or the permissibility of offensive speech is blasphemy. Because in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the Holy Quran, there is no speech which you can muster which is more offensive than blasphemous speech. Obviously, this is subject to debate in a secular country, but if you have an Islamic or any form of spiritual belief to insult God, God forbid, or to insult his prophets, peace be upon them, is the worst type of speech that we can manage to create. But nowhere in the Holy Quran does it legally prohibit blasphemy. So we should really pay attention to that, because this is absolutely against many of the thoughts and the theories given by so-called Islamic states today, particularly Pakistan, that has blasphemy laws. And there are guise under which they're able to persecute minorities all the way throughout the country. But blasphemy at no point is prohibited. The only prohibition, or the only moral prohibition, is found in chapter 6, verse 109, which goes as follows: in the name of God, the gracious, the merciful, and abuse not those whom they call besides Allah, lest they, out of spite, abuse Allah in their ignorance. So it is very different from the legal injunctions which are given in the Quran, which very strongly prohibit certain behaviour and give you a sanction if you breach it. But this verse here is really, it's a moral injunction. It's telling us how we should speak. It's telling us how we should exercise our rights, but it does not prohibit blasphemy. So this is something which is very key, because many people suggest that free speech is limited under Islam, whereas in fact the remit of free speech under Islam is incredibly broad, incredibly liberal, incredibly protecting of the right to freedom of speech. But let's ask a question. Let's say, why should we allow offensive speech? Why should this be something which is permissible? Well, let's start by asking a few questions. Is it offensive to anybody in the room here to say that Jesus, peace be upon him, is God? For some people, it might be. For some people that hold the unity of God to be central to their being, they may consider the concept of the Trinity to be actually the worst form of moral offence that they can muster. And it's the last thing that they would morally want to do themselves. On the other hand, there may be some people in the room that consider it incredibly offensive to say that Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him, is the messenger of God. So if there are any Christians in this room, or there are Jewish people in this room, or maybe just anybody that is secular and agnostic or atheist, for them that might be the height of insult and height of offence. And then there'll be other people in the room today, and for them it is a declaration, it's not a declaration, it's central to their belief system that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, peace be upon him, is the promised Messiah. For other people maybe in this room and for outside of this room, then this in itself is in fact highly offensive. And if you go to Pakistan, this is something which is likely to get you seriously legally punished. Give other examples. Is it offensive to wear the burqa? To some it's highly offensive. Is it offensive to wear a miniskirt? To others it's highly offensive. It depends on your place, on your context, on your viewpoints, your upbringing, your political views. Everything is very much subjective within offence. And this is important, because it's very important that we do disagree about these things. Because if we are going to determine what is good and what is bad, and what is true and what is false, then you need to have a marketplace of ideas. You need to be able to disagree and to say that I think this is the case and that you think that's the case. So we need to have offensive speech, because offence can only take place if somebody disagrees. But disagreement is necessary in order to come to a solid answer on what truth is. And the Quran continually tells Muslims to challenge ideas, to question ideas, to say, is that true or is this true? Test this book and you'll come away fatigued. So I'll give you some brief, so this is, in my opinion, very clear from an Islamic perspective. Let's take a look at human rights law. There's a case in 1997, which is Gunduz in Turkey. So Muslim Gunduz was a self-proclaimed member of an Islamic sect. He took part in a TV debate, and he talked on issues of secularism and democracy. And he said that contemporary secular institutions are impious. He fiercely criticised secular and democratic principles, and he openly called for the introduction of Sharia law within Turkey. So what happened to him was he was convicted of openly inciting the population to hatred and hostility on the basis of religion. So he was criminally punished for this, and he was told that he was inciting public disorder through his speech. But the European Court of Human Rights took a different view. They said that no, Mr. Grundis was not in fact giving remarks which were hateful. They said that he was not bringing court of violence. He wasn't looking to incite religious intolerance, but he was taking part in a debate of general interest and general concern, which was taking place throughout Turkish media at that time. So they said that in fact, in this context, this speech is really offensive. You may find it offensive that somebody agrees with Sharia law and disagrees with democracy, but this in itself is not hateful, or it's not looking to incite hatred. So this type of speech will permit and will allow to happen, because it's important in working out what's the answer to our challenges we face within politics and within morality and within regulating the state. So this was allowed. Another quick example. In Denmark in 1989, there was a group of youths that were called the Green Jackets. And they would wear green jackets, and they would go around and they would commit criminal actions against ethnic minorities and religious minorities. And they would beat them up and they would abuse them. Persecution, basically. And they had a whole ideology to back this up, and it was based upon racism and based upon extremism and xenophobia. So what the TV broadcasters wanted to do is they wanted to interview the Green Jackets. So they made an interview with the Green Jackets and they said, tell us your views, what do you think? So obviously if you do this, you're going to get a documentary full of religious extremism and very much extreme speech. So Jersild did this and he made a documentary, he put it onto Danish television. As a result, he was then punished and he was, the speech was banned and he said, we can't permit this sort of speech, this is illegal. But once again the court came forward and they said, no, this may be offensive to you, but Mr. Jersild didn't himself say this. He took these views and looked to enter them into a public discourse so that you could know about what's happening within your country. His intention was good. His intention was to bring awareness, was to bring education and to deal with the problem of extremism within the country. So his intention, or in Islamic terms, his niyat, was to actually bring a positive outcome. And it wasn't to promote this, it was to expose and to bring awareness to this. So the court and Islam takes a very fine, very, very close microscopic view and a macroscopic view on the effect on society to work out whether something is permissible, offensive, or whether it's hateful. So it was allowed. This was permissible speech, even though it was offensive, it was permissible. So let me just recap as where we are so far. Free speech, very good, we're all happy with it. Offensive speech, it is permissible, legally permissible. But there's something which I should add to it, which is that just because you can say something doesn't mean that you necessarily should say something. Just because I can offend you, and I have the blessing of a microphone here and technology which enables me to talk to you here and these guys on this laptop that are listening to the other end, I could say whatever I like in many ways, morally. But morality, very clear guidance is given, both under human rights law and under Islam, under the Sharia of Islam, that even though you're legally permitted to do something, morally you must exercise your judgment in order to promote certain principles and certain values. And they're the same values under human rights as under the Sharia. It's values of dignity, values of equality, values of respect, values of peace, of harmony. So even if I'm legally allowed to offend you, and I'm legally allowed to make a video insulting any of you in the audience, even though that's actually defamation, so I take that back. But I can say stuff which offends you, but should I? Should I take the opportunity to use my tongue in that manner? Or morally would I be held to account in this life and in the hereafter? And Islam and human rights law make very clear determinations that even though you can do something, doesn't mean you should do something. But that's the realm of morality, like blasphemy. It's so important, it's so offensive, that it's beyond that capacity to judge it. It's held to be of such importance that it's between one human soul and its maker when it crosses to the hereafter. So that's just an important point. However, there are limits to free speech. Offensive speech is permissible, but free speech isn't boundless. You can limit it. You can limit it for privacy. I couldn't go to your homes and bring a television lens and look through your window and make a video of it and put it on YouTube without your consent, because your privacy would prohibit it. I also can't slander you. I can't defame you. I can't dishonour you and look to mock you and ridicule you and expose you to ridicule among society. Both Islam and the Sharia prohibits these things. And most importantly for this film, I could not also promote hate speech. So let me check the hate speech and consider whether this film is free speech or whether it's hate speech. Hate speech is defined as forms of expression which spread, incite, promote, or justify hatred based on intolerance. So it's common things that we sadly come across too often, or perhaps less often now than we used to, but it's forms of racism, it's xenophobia, anti-Semitism, prejudice and intolerance against religious minorities, and any form of discriminatory speech which persecutes in this manner. So this is hate speech, and hate speech is very much illegal under human rights law and under the Sharia of Islam. So what's very important is all the way along you have the same prohibition, the same permissions and the same prohibitions which are mapped out between Islam and human rights. So the Holy Quran prohibits hate speech at chapter 5, verse 34. So I know what you're thinking then. I imagine that you're thinking, well, hate speech is the innocence of Muslims hate speech, or is it free speech? And this is an excellent question. Let's consider some examples before we talk about that. How long am I? Just 10 minutes, okay. So there was a case in Belgium of a man called Daniel Ferre, who was a Belgian MP. This was back in 2007. He was a Belgian MP, and he was the chair of the National Front. So the National Front's a lovely organisation. It's very much like your English Defence League or your National Socialist type organisation. I best be careful before I defame. No, I can't defame an organisation. But it's based upon nationalism, and nationalism is extreme right-wing political ideology. And so he gave some comments. He made some leaflets and he distributed them during an election campaign. And he said such nice comments as, stand up against the Islamification of Belgium and send non-European job seekers home. So Mr. Ferre was convicted of racial discrimination. Now, looking back at what we've talked about so far, do we think that that type of speech, those leaflets, do we think that they should be permissible within Belgium and within the UK? Or would you be happy to receive one? Would you be happy to print one and give one out? Do you think that that should be free speech, or do you think it's offensive speech, or do you think it's hate speech? And the answer is, thankfully, is that this is hate speech. So if you make a leaflet and you say, send the job seekers home, or prevent the Islamification of the UK, then, depending on the context, you're pretty likely to be found to be promoting and inciting religious hatred and racial hatred. And you'd probably come under the UK Act 2006, UK Act of Religious and Racial Hatred Act. Maybe not, it's actually probably too high a threshold, but the European Court of Human Rights thinks that this type of speech is crossing the threshold. This is now hate speech. So this is anti-Islamic hate speech, but then you also have Islamic hate speech, or what you might consider to be Islamic, but in fact is not at all Islamic. It's someone who I'll let you judge for yourselves. Perhaps it's not Islamic. Well, it's not Islamic at all. I'm going to fully retract that comment. In 2003, there was a man called Denis Leroy living in France, and he was a cartoonist. He drew a cartoon for a Basque weekly newspaper. Pardon me, this was actually in September 2011, so it's quite recent. And the cartoon represented the attack on the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. And it was published with a caption next to it. And the caption read, "We've all dreamt of it, ... Hamas did it." So, the blowing up of the World Trade Center, according to this man, it was something that we've all dreamt of, and Hamas did it. Now, once again, should we allow this type of speech? Should this come under free speech? Is this offensive speech, or is it hate speech? And we'll just, do this if I can. Yes. Yeah, lean over a little bit. And so, what do you think?
Yeah.
You'd say, Mr. Mood, you'd say offensive speech or hate speech?
Probably hateful.
You talk about the microphone, didn't you? What do you think? Should this be permissible or not? Okay. Well, it was hate speech. So they said, the European Court of Human Rights said that, again, this is hate speech. He glorified the destruction of the Twin Towers. He'd expressed support for violence which has been perpetrated against thousands of civilians. It is not only that, but it had provoked a certain public reaction, and it had intended to provoke a certain public reaction, which was capable of stirring up violence and having a demonstrable impact on public order in the Basque country, which already is a very volatile place in light of Basque separatism. So from this case law, we can extract some principles. which now we can take to the Innocence of Muslims to work out whether under Islam this film would be permissible and under human rights law whether it would be permissible. So first of all, let's ask, do we find it offensive? In order to work out whether it's offensive, we need to know its content. And hopefully many of you won't have had the misfortune of watching it. But because I needed to present this, then I had to watch it. And I'll give you just some of the content which it talks about. It makes allegations of homosexuality, promiscuity, paedophilia, religious extortion. It says that, I'll give you a quote, every non-Muslim, this is in the words of the script writer and producer of this film, every non-Muslim is an infidel, their lands, women and children are our spoils. So these were the words which were actually dubbed.
Closing loopholes that have not been identified.
Barack Obama. So these, in fact, I'll give you a little bit more information about the nature of the film. It was all filmed with actors and actresses that didn't know what they were filming. It was called The Desert Warrior, first of all. So they thought they were taking part in a film that was in relation to some anonymous desert warrior who was just an Arab and a desert warrior. But then, and the way you know this is not only are the actresses, one of the actresses suing the producer, who's now in jail anyway, for a different tax evasion event, but in fact, what you'll hear is that there'll be normal speech, and then there'll be a dub, which will go over the top, and it'll be someone else's voice saying, and that's where the really, really offensive and question mark hateful stuff comes in. These are some of those things which have been dubbed in. It suggested that the Holy Prophet of Islam, when the peace and blessings of God be upon him, said that every non-Muslim is an infidel, their lands, women and children are our spoils. So this is what the film suggests the Holy Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, said. The film again also suggests that the Holy Prophet, peace and blessings of God be upon him, and his companions were spreading violent aggression. This is another quote. In relation to the Holy Prophet, peace and blessings of God be upon him, that he is a murderous thug, kills men, captures women and children, robs the caravans, breaches agreements, sells children as slaves, and then the rest you don't really want to hear about. So so one thing is for sure, and I know that as I say it and as you hear it, that we can all agree on one thing, that this is offensive. It's offensive, in fact, not only if you're a Muslim, it's offensive if you're a Christian or any human being that believes in truth and believes in humanity and believes in the dignity of the living and the dead, that they shouldn't be insulted so terribly and so offensively. So this is one thing for sure. It's highly, highly offensive. But we already know now that Islam we know that morally Islam strongly, strongly calls upon every human being to be a loving and a peaceful and a caring human being. So you have something to answer for if you produce a film of this nature morally, and I fear for the producer. That's my own spiritual view. But legally, it's not a problem if it's offensive. And it's not even a problem if it's blasphemous. Because legally, again, and we can discuss this afterwards, it's okay to blaspheme. Legally. Morally, it's the worst thing you could possibly do, but legally, it's okay. So we have to ask ourselves, in terms of Islam and our response to this, why are we responding to it under the Sharia of Islam? And as a human rights lawyer, why would I be concerned about this in terms of human rights? And it can't just be because I'm offended. So it's got to be for some deeper reason. And that reason can be quite well summarized as it is hateful, arguably. So let's now examine that concept. Is it hateful? Is it hate speech? In order to do this, I'm going to ask you just some questions. Firstly, does the film intend to inform the public about a social issue? Does it intend to inform the public about a social issue? Yeah. 1 minute? Yeah. Great, I'm nearly done. I can see conclusion on the bottom, horizon. Secondly, does this film intend to contribute to a pluralist debate? Thirdly, or on the other hand, so that's would actually make it protected speech and free speech, if it's contributing to a pluralist debate and looking to inform the public about a social issue. On the other hand, does this film intend to arouse feelings of distrust, rejection, hatred towards Islam and Muslims, a racial group? And also, does this film intend to provoke a certain public reaction capable of stirring up violence and of having a demonstrable impact on public order? If it does those things, then it's hate speech. So I'm going to leave that decision to you guys, and I think we should talk about it further during questions to work out what we think about it. I think what's important as well is that with law it's innocent to proven guilty. And a lot of the summer talks about whether you can judge somebody and did you open up his heart and see what was within it. So I can't necessarily judge his intention, but you can look at the facts around this film and the content of the film in order to answer those questions to some extent. So just to wrap up, Islam and human rights law both permit freedom of speech and offensive speech, but they both absolutely legally prohibit hateful speech. And I'll finish on a Quranic quote once again. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 257, that there should be, in the name of God, the gracious and merciful, there should be no compulsion in religion. Surely right has become distinct from wrong. Thank you very much, and may peace and blessings of God be upon you.